short person. Thank you, Inti. I'd like to thank Inti and Cosmin for inviting me to take part in this conference, and Celia for her amazing assistance. Unfortunately, I'm a little bit sick today, so I apologize for the sound of my voice, and I may need to stop to take some water from time to time, but I'm thrilled to be part of this conference and thrilled to be sharing a little bit of the work that we're doing at M+. I recognize that many of you may not be so familiar with M+, or perhaps have encountered M+ from kind of a distance, or perhaps through media representation. So I'll also take the opportunity to share a little bit in the beginning about M+, where we are, a little bit about the collecting strategy for myself, and about the pavilion exhibitions, of which the project that I'll be talking about, Ambiguously Yours, is part of. And so that gives a kind of context for what M+ as an institution is trying to do through the pavilion exhibitions, and perhaps, you know, from a more kind of insider perspective, I'd like to share some of the curatorial issues, challenges, unexpectedness, unexpected things that came up in the process of doing the show. So this is the M+ building. If I gather some of you are going tomorrow to visit the Yanvo show, and so you'll see it's almost topped out now. It has been, as Inti said, sort of in construction for a while. It's due to be completed at the end of next year and then open to the public at the end of 2020. It's a very pragmatic building designed by Herzog and de Meuron, the same architects that built this building. And you'll see there's a complex of 3 buildings, in fact, designed by HDM. The one at the behind is our conservation storage facility. So that is totally on site. The building itself, the tower you'll see is very narrow, and that will house 2 floors of research center, 5 floors of the curatorial center, and then some members' lounge, some restaurants, and so on. The main exhibition galleries are housed in the architectural slab. So I have a short animation that shows you the main slab where you'll see all of the exhibition galleries. So that just gives you a little bit of an overview of what it would be like to enter the museum onto this floor, where you can access the 4 quadrants of the exhibition galleries. The galleries are very smartly designed. They have different compositions. There's sort of different configurations, small, large, higher ceilings, natural lighting, and so on. And so the architects have thought about how to reduce this issue of kind of museum fatigue. Excuse me. But you'll see a lot of the architectural language is very similar, in fact, to the building across the courtyard, which I hope many of you will have a chance to view to see the Taofei exhibition. So within the museum, there will also be 3 cinemas, small, medium, and large. I won't go into too much detail. And those will be programmed by my moving image colleagues. There's also this space, the grand stairway, which can be used both for lectures as well as moving image presentations. So the collections to date, just to give an indication of, you know, often there is a lot of discussion about M+ as a publicly funded institution. And we think of it as an institution not of Hong Kong, but for Hong Kong. And we're, you know, building an international museum of visual culture. I think one of the misconceptions often is that we are a museum solely of visual art. That's not the case. We're looking a lot at interdisciplinary practice. And in the next slide, I'll show you how we sort of break down this idea of visual culture, which is so difficult to explain to a layman. And so we try to do, through our exhibitions, what it is that we say that we do. So we break it down into the areas of visual art, design and architecture, and moving image. A large component of what we do is archival. As I mentioned, there are 2 floors in the museum building that are dedicated to research center. And the archival collections are primarily of design and architecture, as you can imagine. It's very difficult to collect buildings. We collect models, we collect drawings, we collect plans, and materials that are related to Hong Kong visual culture. This is a little bit outdated, but roughly we have around 5,000 works in the collection. We've only really been collecting actively for about 5 years. And this has been a kind of extraordinary kind of fast-track work by the whole of the curatorial team. When I joined M+ in 2014, the whole team was about 35 people. Today we're around 130 and projected to be around 200 by the end of this financial year. You can see the number of archives, much of that by donation. And just to give you an idea of where the area that I work on sits within the collection, you can see it's around 18%. Again, these numbers are a little bit outdated, but around 18% of the total collection. And of that, 59% is visual art, the rest design and architecture, and moving image. So, as this conference is about heritage, I also wanted to nod, although I won't go into detail, to a project that we did in 2014, which was an online-only project looking at neon. This is something that our community in Hong Kong feels deeply about, not just in its physical form, in its place in the landscape of the city, in the architecture of the city, and how the kind of the visual culture of the city is represented, in particular, in moving image and in cinema. So, as a kind of experimental kind of way of dealing with this issue, we started a kind of crowdsourced online project, which was led by my curatorial colleague Eric Chan and Chloe Chow. And it was also a way for us to identify neons that our community feel are important. That still lives on the M+ website, so you can still visit that. This, however, is the reality of what that looks like when you look into a kind of institutional context. So a lot of the materials are archival. So these are drawings taken, drafts for the final neons that are in our archival collection, and then the actual neons themselves. And you'll see that these present a challenge in interpretation, but also a huge, huge challenge in terms of conservation. We have to have a separate storage space for the neons simply because of size, but also because in the conservation process, there's a lot of hot work. So there's a lot of, electrical work that has to happen that actually can't happen in other conservation spaces and other storage spaces where the rest of the collection is housed. So this represents a major undertaking on the part of M+. As a result, I mean, from those early kind of collecting efforts, we have now come to the conclusion that we can only collect neons that are in pretty good shape at the time that we find them. Often we don't have a very large kind of, or a long turnaround time, because the way that neons come down in Hong Kong is that you receive a notice to say that it has to come down because it's unsafe. And then you have a window in which you can remove it. And often we have this kind of emergency hotline where people somehow find out that they can call us, and they call us and they say, it's coming down, do you want it? You have 5 days. And then, you can imagine an institution like M+, which is not devoid of bureaucracy. It's a process. But we're very excited by what this area of the collection offers us. I think that M+ could end up being a world leader in the conservation and interpretation and presentation of neon. So that's something we're very proud of, and that may be something that some of you may be interested in later. So turning now to the pavilion shows. So, I think M+ has been extraordinary in its history in the sense that it's really created a presence for itself before the museum's been ready. And through the Mobile M+ program, through the online exhibitions, through the M+ Matters series, But this was the first time that we had a kind of physical building to work in. And it's also been the first building that's on the West Kowloon site. So as I said, some of you will go there tomorrow, you'll see it's a very active building site. And the programming here was intended to be experimental in nature, kind of a chance for the curators to play with how we will present the collections in different ways. It's also an opportunity, this would be a subject for another talk, but to present M+'s collaboration with the Arts Development Council in Hong Kong on the Venice Biennale exhibition. So there are kind of several pockets of programming that happen in the pavilion. One is the Venice Biennale Hong Kong show. One is more curatorial experiments. And the other is an area of programming that ambiguously yours sits within, which is one where we're trying to figure out kind of directions in which to develop the collection. So the first exhibition was Zhengin Wao, which some of you may have seen in Venice. So that was the first Venice Biennale presentation that we were able to present in the pavilion. I won't talk in length too much about each of these projects, but indicate that the next exhibition, Shifting Objectives, was the first time that we were able to show projects or the collections from the design collection, looking very much from a transnational perspective and looking at making links that really speak to the region, and that was curated by Eric Chen. This is the project that I'll talk about in a moment. The next project was curated by my colleague Pi Li and looked at the seminal presentation of works from artists from the Canton area, from Guangdong, as part of the Zone of Urgency exhibition presented at the Venice Biennale in 2003, curated by Ho Han Ru. It was a very ambitious exhibition, generated a lot of kind of conservation issues. This exhibition, a lot of the projects that were part of this exhibition were donated to us by an individual collector who had not really unpacked these works since they had come back from Venice. And so it was a kind of a deep curatorial exercise to try and reproduce the conditions of that exhibition. The next was a very museum quality show, which I think was very groundbreaking in an approach to a medium that generates a lot of divergent viewpoints. I think M+ is doing something really exceptional in the area of ink art, in the sense that it's really looking at ink as a medium and not as a tradition, and looking at it as a contemporary practice. And so through a very sort of, actually very traditional framework, Leslie Ma, the curator of the show, has presented actually quite a radical view on ink as a practice, and that is not just the material, it's also the kind of the spirituality of it. The next exhibition was also a Venice Biennale project. Samson Young, the very last one that we did. Most recent exhibition was In Search of Southeast Asia through M+ collections, and so this would fall into the kind of curatorial experiments, looking at a region and how that region can be represented imperfectly and in some ways kind of incongruously through different parts of the collection, primarily visual art, and then the architectural archive collection. So the dissonance, the temporal dissonance that existed in this exhibition was that many of the visual artworks are contemporary, whereas the architectural materials are largely from the 50s and 60s and related to nation building in Southeast Asia. And so that was a kind of curatorial leap, and quite challenging to do, quite challenging to communicate, but actually very exciting in terms of what it says about how we can interpret the collections. The current exhibition that you'll see tomorrow is one of the types of exhibitions where we are looking at how we can expand parts of the collection. It was also the opportunity to collaborate with the Noguchi Museum through the intervention of the artist Yan Vo. So turning to the project that I worked on, I just wanted to say a little bit about kind of popular culture, institutions and popular culture, because I think there are no end of popular culture exhibitions. I think many of you may have seen the David Bowie exhibition, maybe Pink Floyd, or, there is a very important place, I think, for these monographic kind of exhibitions. They really delve deep into the life of individual artists and their inspiration and their impact. I think that an institution like M+ as a visual culture museum will be looking at presenting popular culture, in particular popular culture of Hong Kong, more from the perspective of the work that other institutions have done, such as the Jewish Museum through Revolution of the Eye, where it's looking at the avant-garde and its impact on television. So looking at that kind of intermediality and the deep cross-disciplinary nature of a lot of mass media. The other exhibition that I thought was super interesting was You Say You Want a Revolution, Records and Rebels, and that looked at a very short period of historically, but looked at how music and the counterculture related, very deep exhibition that, of course, because of this time period, looked at the Vietnamese War and a lot of kind of mass media, a highly political exhibition, in fact. So when we came to do our exhibition, Ambiguously Yours, I think the question that we had in our mind was, what can we bring to this conversation, and what can we bring to this sort of enterprise of institutions presenting popular culture? We don't operate in a vacuum. Of course, we are a large museum, but we don't operate in a vacuum. And we have colleagues in the History Museum and the Heritage Museum who have quite deep collections in this area. So what is, in a sense, I mean, I think M+ has the privilege of not having the burden of a comprehensive collection, but that we can look at popular culture through a slightly different lens. So we had sort of several goals in the exhibition. They don't necessarily follow the exhibition the way that we actually organized the exhibition, but there were three main goals, and that was to present the work of artists who kind of, I guess you could say popular culture is mediated through the work of artists. And so this is a installation of part of a work called Hong Kong Intervivos Film Festival by the Hong Kong artist Ho Sin Tong. And it's a work that looks at, it's a fictionalized number of films. She hand draws these scenes from films very much informed by international cinema, creating her own kind of world. And there was another work that we wanted to present, which was Ming Wong's Formulate Stories. I know many of you will know Ming, and he's someone who grew up in a household where Cantonese opera was very dominant. He lived on film, and this is a work in which he plays multiple characters, multiple languages in this work. So that was one of the goals of the exhibition, was to look at how artists are using and mining popular culture through their work. So in this exhibition view, you can see a number of works by Keiichi Tanami, a Japanese pop artist, probably some of the earliest works in the exhibition, that look at the practice of collage as a sort of an absurdist and also kind of postmodern, in a way, a practice, but also how this has been appropriated through the work of designers like Stanley Wong in the poster image that you see on the, it should be your right, of a poster for Chongqing Express. This was quite a radical kind of poster in terms of graphic design because it doesn't show you the stars, it doesn't tell you the name of the film. It's really a kind of frottage of images. And so we wanted to show this kind of intersection with graphic design through the works of artists, photographers, creative directors, working across different art forms. As part of this display, we also included some personal collages from the photographer Wing Sha, who many of you will know is the main photographer for Wong Kar-wai. The next section that we looked at was actually to present kind of popular cultural materials in their own unmediated, in a sense, I mean, except through the curatorial process. And this is where we really used this kind of lens of gender neutrality or gender play as a way of narrowing our field of focus, but also you know, what we found very interesting in the process of doing the exhibition was many of our reference points as a curatorial team that included Chloe Chow and Janice Law, who are younger than me, but many of our reference points were in fact from the 80s and 90s, and we realized that in a kind of informal discussion with our interns, who are of course much younger, they didn't have any direct experience of many of the stars, many of the films, many of the reference points. And so this was one of the kind of challenges. How can we present materials that are of the recent past, but actually already historical? The kind of systems of circulation are no longer as they were, people are encountering these through different means now. I mean, they're re-encountering them. And so we wanted to provide a way in which to look at these materials from a different perspective. So looking also at kind of landmark graphic design works that were produced for the music industry, that have very strong kind of transnational links. There's a very evident relation to Japanese graphic design here. But the starting point for our exhibition was, in fact, this video, which raised a lot of other... Is there no sound? Raised a lot of other issues for us. So some of you will know that this is a video called... Yin Yang Mo Wong from 1984, where Leslie Jung plays both male and female in this very radical dance performance. I won't play too much of this since we don't have the sound.
發過，不禁野下飛飛上。情人夢內心放意放，現在有膽量將愛意盡放。情人問為何色膽太彰，為何令我失望？扮作是雲浪，扮作是迷惘。
So this performance takes place within the context of a, television talent show on TVB. One of the issues that we encountered when we began to work on this exhibition, we worked closely with two advisors, Min Jung-hong from Hong Kong U and Zhao Yufei from Baptist U, both specialists in popular culture from different perspectives. We had a lot of support from them. I think that one of the issues when you're dealing with popular culture is that you are working in a very different economic system. And it's an economic system that is governed by copyright, concern about circulation, concern about sort of image and market impact. And we were sadly unable to secure the rights to show this video in the show, so we were unable to show this, which was in fact one of the kind of first points of reference for us. It seemed such a kind of emblematic work for the show. We were, however, able to work closely with the Heritage Museum. So I talked earlier about this kind of monographic approach to popular culture. We borrowed quite a lot of costumes from the Heritage Museum that were designed by a very important designer called Eddie Lau in Hong Kong, who designed many of Anita Mui's costumes. Fortunately, we're able to show a clip here of Leslie Cheung's live in concert from 1997. And the reason that that concert was significant was that that's the year in which Leslie publicly came out. It's also the concert in which he sort of began to kind of push this sort of image that he had developed of being a matinee idol. And performed in red sequined high heels and in a black sequin suit, and danced with a man. So the goal of the exhibition was really to look at how popular culture was challenging ideas of gender normativity, really in plain sight. And that this kind of radicalness, radicalness, has been somehow kind of subsumed within overall kind of fan culture. And so that's not really been sort of brought to the surface. And we thought that it was a kind of an opportunity for us to bring it to the surface as a very kind of topical issue. You'll see some images, photographic images here that are from Wing Sha, from his 2000 concert, in which he commissioned Jean-Paul Gaultier to design a number of costumes for him. He had something like 5 costume changes through the course of the concert, and wore long hair. While we were unable to secure kind of support from the industry, in a sense, that was quite challenged by the idea of certain stars being represented or being talked about within the rubric of gender. We did have a lot of support from individuals, and the shoes that you see represented here were loaned to us by the film producer Nan Sen-shi. And we presented, as part of the exhibition, 4 clips from very, very different films. We wanted to present films from mainstream cinema, partly as a way to introduce younger audiences to films that they may not have seen. And you'll see this is a still from Stanley Guan's Rouge, that shows Leslie and Anita Mui, Leslie in costume for Cantonese opera. This is 5 years before he plays his signature role in Chen Kai-ge's Farewell My Concubine. I'm just going to show a short clip from when they first meet. Oops. So this film, for those of you who've not seen it, is a romantic ghost story. In a way, it's almost like a kind of Romeo and Juliet. It travels between 2 times. Anita Mui plays the protagonist. She's actually in the film a ghost who's come back to the present to seek her lover. And her lover is... This is where she meets him for the first time. They make a pact to die together because he's from a good family. She's a courtesan. She does die, he doesn't. So she goes back. She tries to find him because obviously she hasn't found him in the other world.
睇斜陽照住嗰對雙飛燕，多依逢窗。聽得秋聲，同葉落，又只見亭橋水流。
邊得嚟咁多仇啫？
So this was an important kind of clip for us to show, both in terms of the visual impact of the film. I think also as a way of showing how gender is played with, not in a very obvious way, but presented in a very subtle way through the interaction between the main characters. I think one of the things that came into play for the exhibition, which we realized actually on the first public day of the exhibition, was that both of these celebrities, for those of you who don't know, are no longer alive. Anita Mui passed away tragically of cancer. Leslie Jung committed suicide in 2003. And so there was very much that kind of idol, a fan idol aspect to some of the visitors to the exhibition. Another way in which we wanted to look at how popular culture as a kind of industry, but also through the sort of star system, I think, in a sense, has dealt with gender is to sort of very subtly look at, much is made of the fact that the popular culture industry in Hong Kong had its heyday in the 80s and 90s, and that now many productions are mainland financed. During the heyday of film production, it was possible to make actually pretty kind of trashy, feel-good films. And this would be an example of that, this sort of Eighth Happiness. It would have been produced for Lunar New Year, just like a Christmas film, and be rather kind of comedic and ridiculous in many of its storylines. And here you see Zhao Yunfat in a way that you wouldn't see him today, who plays an incredibly camp character as a way of seducing women. And so it's a sort of a strategy that the character plays through the film of putting women at their ease and then seducing them. And we also shown, I think, a film that is lesser known, but actually an amazing film, very an insider film about celebrity culture. It's about the star-making system. And the female character, Anita Yoon, takes part in a kind of talent show, and she gets selected to be groomed to be the next star by Leslie Jung, who is the star. But she does it disguised as a boy. And so then comes this kind of comedy of errors, where Leslie Jung finds himself falling in love with his protege, thinking it's a boy, but actually it's a girl, and so on. So it's a kind of comedy, but it's also an insight into the celebrity-making system. And it was so successful, surprisingly, so successful that it spawned a follow-up film. It would have been too obvious for us to present Happy Together, Wang Gawai's film, about a couple kind of in their relationship, having some relationship issues in Argentina. We instead selected an earlier film, Chongqing Express, in which there are kind of ambiguous relationships, the people who don't connect, relationships with inanimate objects. But we also... we're mindful of our audience, and, as an institution, we have an obligation to be as accessible to a broad audience as possible. And so there was not very much kind of racy material in the exhibition, although we were dealing with gender. But we did want to nod to some important filmmakers like Julian Lee and Yon Fan, who've made films around topics of trans culture and gay culture. So I'm running a little bit out of time, so I wanted to talk just briefly about the sort of interdisciplinary nature of many of the individuals that work in the within the industries that support popular culture, so mass media, graphic design, photography, art direction, and so on. These proved to be the aspects of the exhibition that were very, very difficult to show without sort of identifying individuals and saying what role they play in which project, and so that was kind of a huge learning process for us. We worked with Zhao Yufei, who was one of our advisors. Some of you may know him. He's a specialist on gender, kind of transnational popular culture, and he produced a beautiful commission that you can see that visually it's very spare, but his point was that there is a lot of ambiguity in our sort of our sonic lives, if you like, and he looked at his own experience of popular culture was primarily mediated through radio, and looked at radio dramas, looked also at Cantonese opera and men playing women, women playing men, also outtakes, the kind of the breathing sounds that artists make in between recordings, and finally he did a remix of a track. He's also a very famous lyricist, a track that he made for a pop star here called Juno Mack, who called Androgynous. Finally, my colleague Gigi Leung worked with the theatre group Theatre Ronin, whose director Alex Tam had in fact been deeply, deeply affected by a song by a canto pop group called Dat Ming Pai, Dat Ming Pair, from the 1980s, called Mongge Ta Sui Ta. So it's a play on ta, of course. It's a sort of, it can be he, she, it. And he sort of looked at that song to create an interactive performance within the space to actually destabilize the viewing experience for many of our visitors, because they were no longer in a kind of passive viewing mode. They were in fact being challenged by performers in the space, a boy wearing high heels and women performing in a provocative dance and engaging with the audience. So finally, I just make a little plug for our stories platform, M+ Stories, where you'll see a lot of long-form articles, some behind the scenes and collection-related articles. So thank you very much.